Ted in Evanston. Great, Ted. We've got Oakland, California in the house. Thanks for being here. Julie, wonderful. These check-ins are terrific. I have to shout out Lewis from Hawaii. Thanks for being here, Lewis. Wonderful. Bettina in Oak Park. So glad you're here. All right, we'll let that keep going. Have more of you check in. Please do. But I'd like to get us started. So I'm Anna Garcia Doyle, and I'm the Executive Director of the One Earth Film Festival. I want to welcome you to our virtual screening and discussion, which we hope will present rich opportunities for learning and provide a brave and safe space for important conversations that matter deeply right now in our country and across the globe. The new corporation, the unfortunately necessary sequel, speaks to our current moment where everything is marketized and for sale. The quote, "We're so steeped in commodification, it's hard to distinguish between being a consumer and being a citizen," begs the question, what is our alternative future? What do we want to build? I want you to think about this as you watch this provocative film tonight. I don't want to go any farther without thanking our wonderful sponsors and partners. So many thanks to WBEZ 91.5 Chicago and Vocalo, as well as Mother Jones. Two other quick notes at the end of this event. Please share your experiences on the survey linked to at the top of your video window so that One Earth can keep improving what we do. And if your circumstances allow, please donate to support One Earth's nonprofit year-round screening events, youth programs, and more at oneearthfilmfest.org. We are thrilled you're with us as One Earth Film Fest celebrates 10 years of inspiring change and utilizes the power of film to spark change on topics of environment and those intersected with environment, like social justice. The fest has had to adapt to a virtual format, but we strive to stay true to our model. While we're not physically together, we are here together, live, virtually, still able to create community, become aware of issues, engage in dialogue, and be inspired to act. African-American activist Angela Davis said, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world." The stories in our fest films reflect that possibility. Our collective actions will achieve that possibility. Our event will take place in 4 parts. We'll introduce you to some folks who will help us have a great discussion after the film. We'll then watch it together. Then afterwards, we'll unpack the film's themes in a facilitated Q&A with our wonderful panelists. Please participate by using the chat to share thoughts, ideas, or questions. We'll end by sharing concrete actions you can take to be part of the solution. These actions come from our panelists and other action partners. As we live current movements and reframe narratives around justice, environment, and bringing innovative, equitable solutions to our climate crisis, we're hopeful for the future. I am grateful to the knowledgeable filmmakers, film subjects, facilitators, and panelists joining this and other fest events. They'll guide discussions to help spark and sustain actions for the protection of our One Earth and for the just treatment of its resources and its people. We've found that shared agreements help keep our conversations safe and respectful. Please observe these agreements when participating. Put aside your preconceptions, acknowledge your privilege, internalize what you've learned, approach the conversation with respect. Engage your active listening, use I statements and get comfortable with your own story. Acknowledge Native peoples who came before us in protecting our land. One last thing before we meet our facilitator and program participants. If you're active on social media, tell people this is happening. Amplify these voices and be part of the community we're building here together. The hashtag for the festival is hashtag OEFF2021. Thanks again to all of you for being here. And now I'd like to turn it over to our facilitator to introduce themselves, the panelists, and our film.
I'm Olivia, your discussion this evening. I'm a reporter with Mother Jones in our DC bureau and have been spending the better part of a decade reporting on climate change and environment. So we often these and then walk out of the theater without reflecting on what we've seen and how it implications this. So today we have a rich, thought-provoking dialogue sparked by this film, The New Corporation, The Unfortunately Necessary. We look forward to participate, enriching the dialogue with your reflections and questions in the chat and exploring ways to take action. So to introduce the panelists that will be part of our post-film program, and we will be learning more about through the film. So we have here tonight from As You Sow, and I'll have the pleasure of introducing Trish Dolman, the producer, to introduce you to her film.
Thank you so much.
Do you have Trish here?
Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. It's great to see everyone in the chat. Wow, people from all over the country. Thank you so much. I'm Trish Dolman. I am one of two producers of the new corporation, The Unfortunately Necessary sequel. I had the great privilege of working with Betsy Carson, and I'm so thankful I did, because when you take 6 years to make a film, it's a lot of work, and we were able to really tag team. I'm really delighted and thankful to the One Earth Film Festival for joining us, or inviting us. I'm happy to be joining you. I just want to acknowledge the directors, Joel Bakken and Jennifer Abbott, who also spent 6 years of their life making this film. And in Canada, we're all Canadian-based filmmakers. We are very fortunate that we have various government agencies that help and support documentary, as well as very large corporations, namely Bell Media, who is our broadcaster, Rogers, who is a cell phone company, and they have several documentary funds that supported this project, as well as the Canadian government and Canadian taxpayer dollars through Telefilm Canada and the Canada Media Fund and Canadian tax credits. So given the theme of this film, I thought it was important to acknowledge who actually financed it and who was behind it. This is really the brainchild and inspiration of Joel Bakken, who also wrote a book simultaneously with the film, and is the writer of the film as well as the director. Jennifer and Joel made a film in 2003 that you may be familiar with, called The Corporation, and felt 6 years ago that it was time and necessary and urgent to make the sequel. Of course, none of us foresaw the events of the last year, and we had actually finished the film. We can talk about this after, but we decided to open it back up to include the global events of the past year. So I really hope you enjoy the film. I hope you are moved and provoked, and I really look forward to speaking to you after. Thank you so much again to the festival and to the other panelists and moderator for joining me with the conversation. Thanks.
So now we have the film. We'll see you afterwards to hear more from our panelists for a post-film discussion. Hi, welcome back. So that was really powerful, and we already have some comments coming in. So please share in the chat, what are some of the scenes, lines, and people in the film that you remember? And we will get started soon with questions too for our panelists. So starting with Anne, who says, this film made me cry. That definitely was a powerful ending. And we have from Maya saying 100 companies responsible for 71% of emissions. And that was certainly a very powerful stat that really captures the crux of these issues here. We have from Stephanie that saying, I think at this point we need to be fighting for a maximum wage, especially after we've witnessed what's happened to CEO pay. Bettina says, excellent. Such a journey from only helping those in need if it profits the winners and consumers versus citizens to empowerment of the people to join together to say enough. Jen also agrees, saying enough is enough. In fact, we have a few people saying that the same thing. I think that ending, especially, just it really sends a powerful message. So some more comments from folks who watched this. So John saying that 7.8 billion people on the planet, according to world meters, and we need to figure out ways to help each other meet our needs without using inhumane methods like destroying the environment that future generations will inherit. I think that does capture a lot of what this film was about. So, and we have a few more comments before we move on to introducing our panel. Sashi saying, the image that haunts me is the orangutan trying to stop the bulldozer. And another commenter saying that this film made me cry, made me mad, and motivated to take much more action. And we'll certainly be getting into that as well. So I think we will move along now to introducing our panelists. So I think we're going to bring back the panel, and please keep commenting in the chat. So I'd like to introduce Trish Dolman. We did a brief introduction at the beginning, but Trish Dolman is the producer of the film you just watched. She founded Screen Siren Pictures in 1997 and is a leading Western Canadian feature film, documentary, television, digital producer, and director. She has more than 30 documentary and feature film credits over a 28 career and has been screened at marquee international festivals. Trish and her company are committed to making media that changes the conversation. Trish has won a long list of awards that I can't list all of them, but a few highlights are Vancouver's Woman of the Year Award, one of the 100 most influential women in British Columbia, and winning Best Director for the Canadian Screen Award. And Trish also regularly mentors emerging filmmakers, including female producers and producers of color. I'm also excited to introduce you to our second panelist, Olivia Knight, As You Sow's Racial Justice Coordinator. Olivia is a passionate advocate for environmental and social justice. She holds a master's with distinction in environment, development, and policy from the University of Sussex in the UK, where her research focused on African American participation in mainstream environmental movements in the US, investigations into the prison industrial complex, and examinations of racialized landscapes in transit and urban policies. So now we will start with a few questions for our panelists. So please start by adding your questions to the chat, and we will try to get to at least a few of them in the time we have. So I'd love to start with Trish here and get your voice on this really powerful film we just watched. I thought we'd start with talking about a bit about the process and the content and how that's evolved over the 6 years you said you and your co-producer and directors have been working on this film. And I'd especially love to hear how COVID changed that, if it threw a wrench in it, or how it changed the content of this film we just watched. I think, Trish, are we having some problems with volume? I think you might be muted, but... Okay, I think while we're waiting for Trish, we can also get Olivia into the discussion. Okay, so sorry about that. Trish, are you there? Okay, then let's hold that thought and we will move on to Olivia. Sorry about that issue there. We'll get an answer to that question. Okay, Olivia, could we get your just thoughts and reactions to that film we just watched? Particularly... Yeah, so, yeah, sorry, please go on. But I would love your thoughts, especially on how much the film talks about racial justice and just from where you stand in your work, what your immediate reaction is to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I lead Racial Justice at which is a small nonprofit based in Northern California. We do shareholder advocacy and have a direct line with these corporations. So it's a very interesting film for me to watch being in the field that I'm in, because I do talk to these companies on a daily basis about their ESG performance, about how they're showing up for racial justice. Seeing it from this light is very complete and it's very eye-opening. I completely agree that we should be very responsible and we should look at what these corporations are doing, because often this washing, this new corporation type ideal is all we're seeing, because they're not being transparent with the data that they're releasing. And until we have that data, we don't really know what they're doing. So as USO's work, and my work in particular on racial justice, pushes for that information to become public.
One thing that was really interesting about this, I think, was how it raises this question about how much corporate values have supplanted just our humane values and caring for environment and caring for each other. So we see this especially in areas like racial justice and environmental advocacy, this focus on consumer power and consumers buying to support an organization or corporation that supposedly supports those values. And I wondered if you could comment specifically on that, what your reaction to that consumer power argument that's raised in the film.
Absolutely. Well, it's very interesting because I was brought on board to track and monitor corporate statements made in response to George Floyd's murder. So the majority of this initiative is looking at the words that corporations are using to express their sincere and lasting changes that they want to make in their organization to support racial justice. I completely believe it's necessary to question the sincerity of those corporate actions, since they are complicit in perpetuating not only systemic racism, but also economic inequality and climate change. But we do have responsibility as consumers and shareholders to express our values through our buying choices. And with the growing movements on social media that greatly enhance consumer power to join boycotts and share information about corporate actions, there is a way that we can put pressure on the companies to become more transparent and make these changes and become more ESG focused.
So we have a lot of questions coming in already talking about what people can do. And one question from Tim Magner is how best can people pressure Democratic leaders to change their support, I guess, of referencing Reagan's agenda, this carryover of decades of supporting capitalist policy. So Tim wonders how can will Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi embrace those progressive policies?
I truly hope so. I think that if more people get involved and demand change, just like we saw with the racial justice movement and the income inequality movements of 2020, this is not a topic that's going away. And the more we pressure our elected officials, the more we pressure companies to act, the more change we can make. So,
and I will say again, we're looking forward to bringing Trish back once we solve some tech issues. But one thing I learned from this was how much companies are starting to act like independent governments without the same oversight. They literally are engaging with countries around the world as if they are their own power. And Olivia, I wondered from your end, from As You Sow, if you've seen this issue come up, especially when we're talking about clean energy commitments from companies and kind of companies saying they're leading the way on progressive policy. So if you could talk a bit about the pros and cons of that and how much you think that's happening.
Personally, I find it terrifying. That was one of my favorite parts about the film, because it was so illuminating what's happening, that these companies, particularly tech companies, are taking that step to be their own governments, if you will. So from an as you sow perspective, it's very interesting because we'll see industries like oil and gas, who are often at the bottom of all of our scorecards across our program areas, from racial justice to energy. And we see in corporate interactions that they don't feel they have to make any change. They don't feel that they have to be transparent, or that they have to come out strong on social issues such as racial justice, because they're above it. Perhaps because they have too much political backing, perhaps because they have formed their own quasi-governments and can make any type of changes they want. That is truly alarming. And when you walk into a room with a company's representatives and begin thinking about that train of thought.
So I'm excited to say we have Trish back, and I'm sorry about that earlier. I'm very excited to get you in on this conversation. So to get started, Trish, my first question was just the evolution of this, and I'm sorry we had to skip around on questions, so feel free to react also to what Olivia discussed.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can.
Okay, great. So I'll just go back to your very first question, because there's a lot to unpack in this film, and I think what Joel in his writing and Joel and Jen together in the filmmaking have really provided a contextualization so that we can all try to understand better why we are at this place, this crossroads, this extraordinary crossroads, both politically but as human beings, and not just in the United States, but globally. So this is a sequel, as the title says, to a film that came out in 2003 called The Corporation. And that film was made by the same filmmakers, and it was really a look, an analysis, as the opening of the film says, of an institution inside of society, an institution that we as human beings made. I mean, you can't become a corporation unless you're certified by the government, is the irony, right? It's an actual institution that can only exist if governments allow it to. And I think, the thing for me, and especially as someone who's lived in the United States, we've moved away, particularly in America, from seeing government as a reflection of people. Humans invented government. Humans invented democracy, and it is meant to represent us. And what I constantly hear in the vernacular is that somehow government doesn't represent the people, and it isn't working. It's not working. So corporations are maybe a better option, or they can do it better, or they can move faster, so many things. So in 2015, I actually reached out to Joel and said, have you guys thought about making a sequel? And he said, funny, I have. And I think there's a much more urgent need to make a film now. Now, what was interesting is the other filmmakers, Jen included, didn't feel that way. She was like, oh, no, we're going to do this all over again. I mean, the first film took 5 years. It was a lot of work, kind of painful sometimes, the making of these films and giving birth to them. So she was somewhat reticent, but Joel was really convinced. And the reason why, and sort of its thesis of the film, is from 2003 to 2015. So in 12 years, we went from being a society looking in, and the publicity photos from that first film were them looking at this like office with cubicles, literally a metaphor for looking at this institution. And the thesis of that film was that corporations were psychopaths. And so why would we give them the rights of the person, and how can we trust them? But that in 12 years, society had radically changed, and we had become engulfed by corporations. We were now living inside of corporations. We are human beings in the fishbowl surrounded by corporations. Everything we do is corporatized, marketized, tracked. And in fact, a woman in the chat put what was most powerful for her was that Trump was the symptom, not the problem. And it was really interesting. I just watched Gibney's doc the other day, Totally Under Control, and what was a very good film. I encourage you to watch it, really about digging in deep to the pandemic and how the Trump administration handled it. But at the end, he called him a politician. And as a Canadian, Trump is not a politician. He is a puppet. He is a figurehead for absolute and total corporate control of America. Like in his time, it's the largest amount of deregulation, right? The largest tax cuts ever in history. So if you look at it, and I think what the film is trying to say, it's been 70 years of gradually disassembling what was the greatest middle class, the most revered democracy in the world, has been gradually, brick by brick, sort of disassembled. And the only way democracy is going to thrive again is if the people take it back and get involved and say, democracy is a representation of us. And it will only thrive if we make it thrive. I could just go on. You can tell I'm very passionate, but...
Yeah, clearly you've been so close to this subject. We have a great question of a few questions I'd love to get to from the audience. So one is actually, are there any large corporations that are truly sincere about social equality and climate issues and other issues like that? I think that's a great question actually for both Trish and Olivia. So Trish, if you could take that first, if you think there is any large corporation out there you'd point to as an example.
Yeah, I'd like to clarify that the film is specifically looking at publicly traded corporations, right? And there's a distinction between publicly traded corporations and privately held corporations. Because as soon as you become a publicly traded corporation, you have to fulfill a mandate of the bottom line, of delivering profit to shareholders, and that profit must always increase. And that is the conundrum of the corporate structure, because sacrifices will be made, laws will be broken, people will die to maintain corporate profit, which is, I think, what the film shows, that people will rationalize, look at Volkswagen, will rationalize fabricating evidence about emissions, right? Mining companies will literally enslave and kill people. So I think there's numerous privately held corporations that can be cited that do have good policies. But I think the rest, even if the intent, right? It's like so many things, it doesn't matter about intent, what your intent was. You can say, oh, that wasn't my intent. It doesn't matter. So they can be well-meaning and well-intentioned. But ultimately, it's a lie that there is any other mandate than to deliver profit to shareholders.
Right.
And that will always trump everything.
Yeah. And we had a comment from Tim also pointing out B Corp certification, public benefit corporation. So I guess there's other models we're talking about as well as the publicly traded. And Olivia, maybe you could respond to Trish, but also if you'd like to comment on that, the different types as well.
That's great that somebody mentioned B Corps because I was about to. Wonderful business model. Everyone should look into them if you're not already familiar with that shareholder and business model. But going off of what Trish said, I absolutely agree. Capitalism in itself is a flawed system, and so it's not a surprise that these corporations are flawed in their business models. But what we as shareholders and consumers can do is practice our ESG, environmental social governance goals. And we can push for these corporations from the inside to make changes that will spread throughout our social structures. If that's the system that we have right now, we've got to work with it until we can dismantle it.
And on that note,
sorry, can I just add something? It's funny, we had a whole debate about B Corps and whether to include them in the film, and ultimately you have to make some sacrifices because you can imagine, I think our first cut of this film was 6 hours long. So you have to make some sacrifices. But I think that the biggest lie that we've been told as human beings is that consumers are responsible for these problems. And I'm really glad someone in the chat pointed that out, that 71% of all emissions are created by 100 corporations. Because we have been then fed this lie that we're responsible as consumers and we can change it by just changing our consumption patterns. We don't need to do anything else. We don't need to get involved in our democracy or run for office or, meet our politicians or give them feedback. We can just change our consumer habits. And that, I think, also is a huge lie. Individuals are not responsible for global warming. It's lack of regulation and corporate greed.
That's a really interesting distinction. I come across that a lot in my reporting, and transitioning actually really well to one of our questions before, one of our last questions before we move on. But so this is from Garen, and he asks, what are some of the biggest misunderstandings you see from folks in the environmental movement about so-called green companies or organizations? So Olivia, maybe you could talk about some misgivings that you have about how companies might approach that quote-unquote green policy.
Well, as we all know, greenwashing is a very dangerous thing, and it's something that's become very present in our society. Thank you, the new corporation. It's something that everyone needs to be aware of. And as Trish was saying, these corporations are the ones that have caused this deep, widespread environmental destruction. It is not the individual. And so people need to realize as they look at these green policies that are rolling out of these large companies, that they need to take them with a grain of salt. And they need to demand transparency into corporate actions so that we can know and we can track and monitor what these corporations are really doing, because then will we really be able to change what they're doing.
Right. And one last question from Tim for our panel is, how do we move past the message that we just need to be better individual consumers? So I think this transitions really well to the last part of our panel, which is, how do we take action? I think that question's touching on what can people fired up by this film do next? So I think we could start with Trish on that one.
Sure, and that was something, we really took some of the feedback from the first film where people felt like disheartened and wanted more on what they could do, because I do think it's part of media messaging to make you feel powerless, to make you feel that your voice doesn't matter, to make you feel like your vote does not matter. There have been campaigns by Cambridge Analytica to actually cause people to not vote so that they tamper with election results in Haiti and other countries. So that the first thing we need to throw away is that as an individual, we're powerless to make change, because we absolutely are. And change can be small, whether it's just becoming involved in your own local community, getting involved in your local school, or even volunteering or running for local office, running for the Parks Board, running for the School Commission. Any place where you can help stop corporate domination and create change. All of those places are places where you can cause there to be change. And I don't know about you guys, but I live in Vancouver, and I regularly try to meet with my local politicians. A lot of my advocacy has to do around film and television and women in business and entrepreneurship, but also around environmental issues, because a lot of the films I make are about environmental activists, etc. So there's just so many ways that people can create awareness and get involved. So, I mean, we could list them off in more detail if people want, but I think everyone's pretty engaged and educated who are watching the film already. But I think that's the thing, is that to think that somehow government are separate from us and representative of our democracy are separate from us is the biggest victory that corporations have achieved. Because I hear people disparaging politicians all the time. And what we need to do instead is hold them accountable, not just other them, but actually hold them accountable for their actions. And they represent us, not the other. Right now, they're representing corporations. That's what I feel. We've moved into this direction where we've gotten out of balance. And you see these patterns in human history, right? You know, sort of economic models and social models last a few hundred years, and then we transform. And I think we're on the precipice of another major transformation. But the risk is, one of the ways we could go is absolute corporate feudalism if we don't radically engage in democracy, because something else will come out of it. And democracy isn't perfect, and government hasn't been perfect. There are fair criticisms, absolutely. But there's always a balance. And so I just think we're at this really, really, really important juncture in human history. And we all need to roll up our sleeves and get involved, like every single one of us. No one can be a bystander right now, as far as I'm concerned.
Olivia, would love to hear your take on that. Actions anyone can take, and also within their community, organizations, and governments and companies.
Well, I agree with Trish yet again. Everyone needs to get involved, activated, and educated to make a change. And we as individuals can make that change. We need to demand disclosure, transparency, and a change of system to switch over from capitalism into something that's more fair and just for the global system. We need to invest along our values if we are going to buy into this current capitalist system until we find something better. And we need to stay educated. We need to make sure that our friends are educated, that our parents are educated, that everyone in our life feels like they can control and have the power to make change. Get involved in your local government, as Trish was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear from you guys. I mean, in Canada, certainly the pandemic, like it's kind of started a massive seismic shift in Canada, started with Me Too. Like suddenly the gender parity conversation flipped. It was like a switch had flipped. And then because we in Canada, we're a socialist country, and I feel like socialism has this terrible name. But if you look at it, that's effectively what it is. But when you have a country that invests heavily government money in business and all different sectors, you can't have that government hand out money that doesn't represent the people. So first, the gender parity thing happened, and all of a sudden it was like, wow, we don't even have gender parity in our political representation or in our spending. And then what the George Floyd protest did is they actually flipped another huge conversation in Canada around race. And I know it did in the US as well, but the great thing about being able to hold government accountable is people really came out and said, enough is enough. We do not have proper representation along racial lines, because Canada, like the US, most of our cities are 50% non-Caucasian. So we should have that representation in our government and on our screens, on television. And so that conversation and that change is ongoing. And that's what's been very heartening for me, is people taking to the streets really actually has caused a seismic shift, at least in my own country, and I think in the U.S. I think in Europe, I'm talking to a lot of Europeans right now. It's taking a little longer, but I think that change is happening, and that's extraordinarily powerful.
So our next slide actually summarizes some top actions that were submitted ahead of time by our panelists and summarizes what we've discussed, and I think includes some other actions that help connect to your community. So we've talked about many solutions people can take. Trish talked about getting involved in running for office, or at least engaging in elections, whether it's your school commission or meeting with politicians. And Olivia talked about building a fair and just society, at least even buying our values until we find something better. And we had a comment from Freda that since the only way to invest one's money for retirement income is through the existing economic structure, she wondered if there's another way to invest without supporting corporations, some other more progressive, sustainable solution. So these are all great ideas for how to take action in your community. And we will be sharing these points, as well as a recording of the discussion and a transcript of the chat with all of these ideas and resources, just so people can review these later. So I wanted to wrap up by thanking our incredible panelists, Trish, Dolman, and Olivia Knight, for this really fascinating discussion. I wish we could go so much longer, and giving so generously of your time and experience to give us this really insightful conversation about corporate power and discussion about the new corporation. So as we close out, just wanted to give some final reflections on what we've discussed, and wanted to discuss One Earth's 10-year theme of inspiring change. And if you would love to you to contribute in the chat about ways you are ready to take action and to inspire change, perhaps something you're compelled to do as a result of tonight's discussion and the event. So would love to hear your responses in the chat. Again, wanted to thank everyone for participating in such a lively discussion. We'll have our contact information on a final slide, and links for seeing more work from As You Sow and from Trish. And hope people continue the conversation after this evening wraps up. So thank you so much, and hope to see you at another screening for One Earth Film Festival.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Olivia. And pick one thing. I make films. Just pick one thing and put all your passion into it. Olivia does environmental action. Rebecca's a journalist. I mean, I just think we all just have to pick one thing, brick by brick.
Yeah, that sums it up.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to be here.
Thank you.